All right, let's go ahead and bring it back together. So where were some places that we noticed the law in this second part of Deuteronomy, which again means second law? So I'm guessing there'll be quite a few spots. But what were some that stuck out to us? Came up at our tables.
A couple of the things that are mentioned, like around page 285 and 286, are still like civil code today and make sense. Just a couple.
Mm-hmm. So in some of the things 285, 286 still make sense in civil code today.
Yeah, like extradition of prisoners.
Yes. Yeah, there's this extradition things from the cities of refuge. Distinctions between accidental death, the axe head flying off the axe, and murder. Yeah, so some of these things make sense, and some of these things don't, right? Some of these things wouldn't make any sense to apply today. Mm-hmm. Good. Where else did we notice in the law here? Yeah.
Keep all your vows. Page 291.
Keep all your vows.
Whatever your lips utter, you must be sure to do.
Yeah. Whatever your lips utter, you must be sure to do. Yeah. Jesus sort of let your yes be yes, your no be no. Right? We get this in the gospel. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
289. There's a lot of rules that we don't keep now. Like do not plow with an ox and a donkey yoked together, or women can't wear men's clothing and a man wear women's clothing.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Don't wear clothes of wool and linen woven together. There's these sort of mixing. So we talked about this a little bit in, so this is page 289, these different rules that are not things that we, certainly in a legal sense, enforce today, right? There's some sort of social things, ways that these are like frowned on or not, but they're certainly not things that are enforced. Another one is the proof of virginity section. Like that's a whole thing that doesn't even really biologically work, right? But that is too. So some of these things, when we talked about clean and unclean in Leviticus, especially, for example, that some of these things are ways in which you are identified as being, Israel, ways in which Israel is identified as being the Lord's special possession, right? So a holy kingdom of priests, a holy nation. And so it's not so much that like wool and linen together are like somehow anathema to God. It's that, no, you, Israel, are not supposed to do this. So this verse came up over here, I think. Do not eat anything you find already dead, right? No roadkill. But you can give it to the foreigner who's living among you, the person who's immigrated in, the person who's not part of Israel but is living in your place. Because things that you find dead might be perfectly fine. This isn't a health code issue. This is a cleanliness issue. Israel is supposed to eat meat when they sacrifice it to God, right? There's a specific pattern. The blood has to be poured out. It has to be kosher. So if something that's been found dead, you can't promise that's happened. And for Jews today, that's still, you eat things that have to be, slaughterhouses have to be kosher certified, for example, and a rabbi will come and do that typically. And you're not supposed to, even if another one maybe has slaughtered it that way, if you can't know for sure, you're supposed to avoid it. So there's something similar going on there where for the person who's living among you, they can eat that. I mean, if it's rotting, they're not going to, but if if it recently died, they can do that, but it's not for you, Israel. So it's an issue of you are my treasured people, and this is part of how you show that. Yeah. That also means that these aren't necessarily laws for all time, right? So these are laws for a particular people in a particular place. Yeah. Good. Where do we notice the gospel? Yeah.
Okay, so I wondered on page 276.
276.
The sentences, so if you faithfully obey the commandments, then I will send rain. If you carefully observe, then I will dry up. Is that kind of law and gospel in one sentence?
I would say, yeah. So let's read it. If you faithfully obey this, I will send rain. I would say that's the law, and the law can have good results, right? Okay. You obey the law, and good things happen to you. Gospel is going to be a promise that comes apart from you. So Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, I think it's the Sermon on the Mount, at some point, Jesus will say, your Father sends rain on both the righteous and the wicked, right? And it's not ours to wonder that, like it's not a part of we don't get to judge that. But the Lord sends rain on the righteous and the wicked. So there is God giving good things to the wicked. So there we could recognize something closer to gospel, I would say. Yeah, good.
Page 303.
303.
The Lord gave this command to Joshua, son of Nun, be strong and courageous. You will bring the Israelites into the land I promised them on oath, and I myself will be with you.
Very good. Yeah, so this promise to Joshua. They call it a command, which is interesting, but it is gospel. Be strong and courageous. You will bring the Israelites into the land I promised them on oath. I myself will be with you. Yep, that is a great word of gospel for Joshua there. Very good.
What about on 271, where it talks about, do not covet silver and gold on them, and do not take it for yourselves. You will be ensnared by it, for it is detestable to the Lord. It kind of reminded me of, leave all you have behind and follow Jesus.
Sure. So do not covet the silver and gold. Do not be ensnared by it, which is really interesting. Yeah, I think I would say this is law, but it's something to preserve, to not be ensnared by something. I mean, that is the function of the gospel, is it sets us free from what ensnares us. So there's something close to the gospel, or at least leading towards the gospel here, I would say. Yeah, good. What surprised us? What are some things that surprised us here in Deuteronomy? Yeah.
Page 298, how Moses details the horror culminating in eating of their children.
Yeah. So this is siege. Yeah. Okay. So repeat for the recording. 298. This repeating of the curses that will happen if you do not follow this, right? Which it is part of the intro to the Deuteronomy says this is part of the standard form of these treaties that are made, is that there is this is what happens if you don't obey them. This is what happens if you do obey them. Now, I would say the specifics of the curse, because generally these treaties are between like human kings. They're not quite the same as this, but the specifics of these curses are different. But especially, because of the suffering your enemy will inflict on you during the siege, you will eat the fruit of the womb, the flesh of the sons and daughters the Lord your God has given you. Even the most gentle and sensitive man among you will have no compassion on his own brother or the wife he loves or his surviving children. Things will be so bad and desperate that cannibalism will be the only thing that will deliver people in this siege. And that happens in real sieges, right? So this is not, this is extreme in its descriptions, but this is something that Israel or people in Israel will experience actually in the centuries to come when, say, the Assyrians come in and siege Jerusalem for many months. And this is the sort of language the Assyrians themselves used to demoralize the people they're sieging. Like, this is what's going to happen to you. You're going to be eating your own because there won't be anything else for you there. Yeah. And we're going to read about that siege, actually, in particular, comes up in near the end of this volume, but it's in here. Yeah.
Well, one thing that surprised me as I read through this is because of all the favor that God is giving to the Israelites. Is this why people have always hated the Jews?
So the question is because of the favor that God is showing to the Israelites, is this why the Jews have been hated? Possibly. I think there's certainly some Jews that would answer yes to that, I'm sure.
Well, and they've destroyed some other countries when they came in.
Yeah. Certainly they've made enemies for themselves or are about to in the book of Joshua, which we're going to be reading this coming week. Mm-hmm.
I can see why that would be resented.
Yeah. Well, and that connects, today, right? You have in Israel, the modern nation of Israel, a lot of the resentment towards the Israelis comes from their control over land that was, most of a century ago, controlled by Arab Palestinians, right? And so there's a resentment from the actions of the past, yeah. And even if, the people who were in control of it was the British Empire, and before that it was the Ottomans, neither of whom were Arab, but still, there's the sense of the invaders coming into the land, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
On page 311,
311.
second paragraph.
Mm.
It says, and Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord has said. He buried him in Moab. Is he God?
Yeah, so page 311, this is Moses' death in Deuteronomy 34. God buries Moses. That's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that they translate that he died as the Lord had said. Literally in Hebrew, it's on the Lord's mouth is actually what the phrase in Hebrew. So it either means something like as God had predicted, or I think the NRSV translates it as God commanded, or at the Lord's command, that God sort of said, all right, Moses, now it's time. And Moses breathed his last, the servant of the Lord, to the very end, in a way. And then God buries him. Yeah.
Last Sunday, when you talked about the 4 phases of Moses,
yeah,
and when Moses appeared with Jesus, is that because God buried him where he was, or what?
So yeah, why is Moses the one who appears with Jesus, even though he has died? Maybe because God knew where Moses' burial spot was, and so God was like, "Oh, I know where Moses is. I'll go resurrect him real quick and bring him to Jesus." Maybe that's why. That's funny. What else? What else surprised us? Or what else is maybe gnawing at us? Yeah.
Page 288.
288.
Halfway down, if the man has 2 wives and he loves one but not the other, both bear them sons, but the firstborn is the son of the wife he does not love. When he wills his property to his sons, he must give the rights of the firstborn to the son of the wife he loves, in preference the actual firstborn. That made me think. There must have been arranged marriages, so you might have been forced to marry the first wife.
Oh, absolutely arranged
And
marriages.
so,
Yeah.
But that would have been like a contractual agreement between families or tribes.
Exactly. Yeah.
And,
Marriage in general would be contractual agreements between
but
families.
you're breaking that if you give your inheritance to the one of the son of the wife that you love the best.
Well, I think you misread. It says he must not give the rights of the firstborn son.
Okay.
Yeah. So that law, this is on 288. If a man has 2 wives and loves one but not the other,
Okay.
you can't favor the child of the favorite wife. Which is interesting because who does that? Do you remember who favors the child of his favorite wife? In Genesis. Jacob does. Yeah, Israel does, right? So Joseph is the child of Rachel, the wife whom he loves, and he gives him this special robe. And yep. Mm-hmm. And the double portion, so the firstborn gets a double portion, and the reason for that mostly is if you divide your possessions equally among all your children, none of them will really have enough to keep sustaining, or the chances are, unless you have an extremely large estate. And so you give a double portion to one of them, who's the firstborn, in order that your farm can continue. It's like if you've inherited a farm from your parents, but they divide it between 8 of you, you're not going to be able to function as a farm as well as if one person takes it over. That's the idea of what's going on there. Yeah, what else is weighing on us or surprising us or making us wonder?
It wasn't fun to read.
Deuteronomy was not fun to read. Did that surprise you? Did you expect it to be?
I don't know.
No, it's not particularly fun. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that if you came across a body that had obviously been murdered or there was an unanswered death, and then they had to atone with it with a was it an ox or a cow? I can't remember. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And its neck had to be broken or whatever. I was surprised because they didn't that they gave this animal sacrifice versus really trying to determine what had happened. Yeah, good. So, and I don't remember what page this is on, but it's like 287.
287 maybe. Here it is.
288.
Where if a body is found, so if somebody is found dead, the elders of the town in the region which it was found have to come and make atonement for it. So there's a sacrifice that happens as part of that. There's a couple interesting things about that. One of them is that the leaders of the town are responsible when a murder happens in their town, even if they can't bring it to justice, if it's just not feasible. I mean, forensic science at that time, I'm sure, was much different than it is today. So if it's not really feasible to figure it out, they're not off the hook. The leaders of the town have to go and they have to make atonement. They have to be involved in this ritual of atoning for this. And I found that interesting too, that there's this responsibility to being a leader that I think we don't always recognize, actually. Like, I think it would probably be better if our elected officials took full responsibility for everything that happened in their towns, even when it's beyond their control. Yeah, good. Yeah, what else? What else are we wondering about, or what else surprised us or bothers us?
Well, on page 284, it says, when the Emmanuel land the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us, you should appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. But in the newsletter, you had written about Samuel 1.
Yeah, wanting a king. Yep.
And he was disturbed by them asking.
Yeah, and God is disturbed, right? Right? It's not you they've rejected me as being king over them, God says. Yeah, so to repeat for the recording, so on page 284, this is Deuteronomy 7:18 probably, somewhere in that range. And this is sometimes called the law of the king, because there's this part in Deuteronomy, when you're in there and you demand a king, and God's going to let you have a king, and you get the sense maybe it's, here it's not, it's kind of neutrally said, but later on it's like clear, God doesn't really want you to have a king, or at least not in the same way your nations around you have. Here are the things that bind you. And we're going to see this. I'm glad that you lifted this up, because I was going to mention this if it didn't come up till by the end. As we continue to go through Joshua, Judges, not so much Ruth, although a little bit, and Samuel, Kings, this idea of what does it mean to be a king? What does it mean to have a king like the nations around us? And from Israel's perspective, and I forgot the last thing I was going to say, but that question is going to continue with us. Like, what does it mean to have a king, and should we even have a king? And what makes a good king versus a bad king? So, yeah, I'm glad you've noticed that. I'll point out a couple things here. So this long paragraph is in the middle of page 284, or two paragraphs, I guess, but kind of set off. So these rules of the king, if you pay attention to them, they're strange rules for a king to have. So actually, maybe I should just have you all at your own tables. Look through this, and I want you to notice there are, I think, 3, if I remember right. There are 3 particular restrictions or jobs that a king is supposed to have that are unusual. And let's just take a few minutes at our tables and look through and see if we can identify what a few of those are. There might be 4, I can't remember, but 3 is what I have off the top of my head. All right, let's go ahead and come back. What are some things that we discovered that in this law of the king here in Deuteronomy? Yeah?
He has to be an Israelite, he can't take many wives, and he can't accumulate lots of money.
So the king has to be an Israelite, can't take many wives. What's the significance of taking many wives if you're a king? Does anybody know?
Is it wealth?
It's not wealth exactly.
His heart will be led astray.
So it says his heart will be led astray. That is part of the reason for why not many wives. This happens to Solomon very famously. Too many heirs could be. Why, if you are a king, why would you? What do marriages do when you're royalty?
Give children.
They give children. What else do they do? Who do you marry?
Other countries.
Other countries. So this is alliances. So what's the king not to do? Form alliances with other nations. What are kings supposed to do? Form alliances with other nations, right? Okay, so not supposed to do that. The second one is a little more straightforward. Not amass wealth for themselves. What's the point of being a king if you can't amass wealth for yourself, right?
You're less likely to be corrupt if you're not wealthy.
So you're less likely to be corrupt. Good. What else did we notice that's strange in this law of the king here? Yeah.
Let's see, the third paragraph down at the end, near the end of that paragraph, it says, "Do not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites and turn from the law to the right or to the left."
Yep.
That would be nonpartisan.
Yeah. So So the king is not to consider himself better than his fellow Israelites. And kings, not just in that time, but kings in that time were better. I mean, the Egyptians worshipped their king, Pharaoh, as a descendant of the gods, right? I mean, like, this is there was no sense. We have this sense of equality and that the leaders are not above the people. That is not a part of that culture at all. That's not there at all. Kings are often thought to be divine. They are so much above. And you typically are often not bound by their own laws. They're above their laws. But here, that he shall not, what does it say? Not turn, he shall not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites and turn from the law to the right or to the left. So not showing favoritism because of his own personal thoughts or opinions. He's supposed to be devoted to the law, which, by the way, the king is not making, God is giving, right? Anything else we notice? What's the king's primary job?
Rule.
So to rule, what's his primary job here? It's a little different, actually.
Writing down the copy of the law, reading it every day.
Writing down the law, the Torah, and reading it every day. So the king is to study the Bible, we could say. That's the king's job, is to study the Bible. This is not a king that any nation would assign for themselves. There's one other that we missed. He's not supposed to collect horses for himself. Now, why do horses matter? Army. Horses are animals of war. They're not used for farm. So we use horses, or not anymore, but we used to use horses for farming and that sort of thing. And this time, horses are military. That's what you use horses for, because they take a lot of resources. It's a waste to use them for farming. Oxen are better. Donkeys are better. Yeah.
What was the relationship between the horses and returning to Egypt?
Good. So let's see. The king must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you. So who is the great military power of the time? It's Egypt. In fact, what's going forward in Joshua, when they are coming into the land and they are going to go up against these walled cities, the walled cities are in some ways extension of Egypt's power in the region. Egypt has something of an empire. It's not an incredibly strong empire in this region at this time, but the examples of its power are these kings in these walled cities who, I don't know if they pay a tribute to Egypt. I don't know exactly what the connection is, but they're sort of extensions of Egypt's influence in the region. So in some ways you can think of the conquest as they have gotten out of Egypt and now they are liberating the land from Egypt's influence, from the peoples there that have made their own deals with Egypt. This is going to come up later too. In fact, during one of the exiles, I'm trying to remember. I think it's in Isaiah. It was with Hezekiah. So it'd be during the Assyrian Empire. I'm pretty sure when they're coming in. I'll talk about this in a bit. But they siege Jerusalem is one of the things they do. One of the things that the king wants to do is turn to Egypt for help. And if I remember right, the metaphor that's used is Egypt will be like a reed that you lean on, and it pierces your hand. Like this won't be a good alliance for you to make. So that's this returning to Egypt. You could think of both as returning to the ways of Egypt, but also literally just looking for military support from Egypt, becoming another one of these vassal kingdoms here in the land, just like these ones are. And God says, no, in a sense, I will be your king. So if there is a king in that sense, it is God. God is the one who's giving the law. God is the one who is above and outside the law in the way that the human kings often were, but God is the one who can be that way. And the human king must not do any of the things that a king typically would do, but rather is to be the chief expert on the Torah, right? Which is just, you can hear people saying, this is ridiculous, we're going to be run out of the land by everybody who's stronger than us, which is basically what Israel will say. And God will give in to them a bit. But then the stories of Samuel and Kings, at the end of, in Kings in particular, at the end of every king's reign, there's sort of an evaluation of how they did. And with one exception, kind of 1.5 exceptions, they're all bad. So one of the things that's going to happen is they do get a king, and then almost every one of them is an object lesson of why having a king was a bad idea. There are a few faithful ones, David famously, but even David is a problem. And there's all sorts of rebellion that happens at the end of his reign. There's a lot of death that happens securing this line of succession, for example. We'll get to that as we continue to read. But yeah, so what should a king be and not be, and how does that play out in the history over the next several centuries of history that we'll be reading in the rest of this volume? Yeah.
But today, Egypt is not letting refugees into their country.
Yeah, so today Egypt is not letting refugees from Gaza into their country. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know enough about all the reasons for that, but yeah, the situation in Gaza is just bad. Speaking of sieges, right? That's something of a siege there. Yeah. Yeah. What else? Anything else that surprised us or were we wondering about? And I'll do a little intro to Joshua. Yeah.
Moses recites a song towards the
Yes,
end.
the Song of Moses at the end.
And
Yep.
I was wondering if in all versions of the Bible, is it always a song? How do they know it's a song?
So, good question. So, how do they know it's a song? And song can mean poem. Like, we don't have any sense of melody. There's no musical notation here. It has to do with the way it's written. So, if you looked at this in Hebrew, for example, this wouldn't be, they've set it in the center in this kind of, way that obviously says poem or song to us. But like right at the beginning, so I'm at the bottom of page 303 here. So he says, "Listen, you heavens, and I will speak. Hear, you earth, the words of my mouth." So something that Hebrew does in its poetry is something that's we call parallelism, where it will say something and then it will say the second thing. It'll say it again in slightly different words. So here we have it. "Listen, you heavens," is parallel to "Hear, you earth." "And I will speak" is parallel to "the words of my mouth." So Hebrew doesn't rhyme in its poetry like English poetry often will. There's not a real clear meter to it necessarily, but one of the hallmarks of it is this sort of parallel speaking. A pretty good example of this actually is the prophecy from, I'm going off the top of my head. I can't remember now, where the riding on a donkey. So when Jesus comes into Jerusalem on what we call Palm Sunday, was that Malachi? "Behold, your king comes to you." It was Zechariah. I think it's Zechariah. Humble, riding on a donkey, and then it says something like gentle on the child of a donkey, right? And so it's saying the same thing twice, and this is a poetic parallel. But then in Matthew's gospel, and Matthew's the only one who says this, Jesus actually is on somehow both a donkey and its colt. It says riding on them, like somehow they're both together. But there's this parallelism to the lines. You'll see it in the Psalms all the time too. And once you get a sense for it, and when we go through the Psalms, I'm sure we'll get even more of a sense for it. You get this there's these pairs of lines. Sometimes they're threes, they're not always pairs. But so just on the next page, "I will proclaim the name of the Lord. Oh, praise the greatness of our God." So you've got these sort of saying the same thing in two ways. "A faithful God who does no wrong. Upright and just is he." So you're, again, saying the same thing. And there's it's not a rhythm exactly, but in Hebrew especially, often they'll have the same number of words. But it doesn't translate well to English because we have to use several words to use one word in Hebrew, for example, and other ways around. Yeah.
It makes me chuckle because I'm thinking he must really feel like we're slow learners.
Yeah, he has to say it twice. Yeah. Well, in some ways, this is just good teaching techniques, right? Yeah. If you've ever taught children love repetition, right? I have a 3-year-old who loves to read the same books over and over and over. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good. What else? Anything else that we noticed? I want to talk a little bit more about the Song of Moses here, but before I go to that. Anything else? Any other questions we want to bring up before I sort of start to go in my spiel? Yeah.
Well, in that song of Moses, there was I don't know who it is, Jeshurun?
Yes, Jeshurun's another name for Israel. It happens just a couple of times, and it's a little unclear why. It either means something like the upright ones, so the one who was supposed to be upright grew fat and kicked, filled with food, became heavy and sleek, abandoned the God who made them. Or it might be a diminutive for Israel. So in Hebrew, Yisrael, here it'd be Yeshurun. So they sound a little more similar in Hebrew than they do in English. But it's standing in for Israel. It's a poetic name for Israel, maybe. But it only happens a few times. It's a little, it's a good question. So down at the bottom of that page, so this is page 305. Or actually, no, I want to go to the next page. Let me try. No, I want to go before it. Sorry, I want to go to page 303. I forgot where I was going. So page 303, I just want you to notice something. So right before the song starts, the Song of Moses, Moses says something about what the result of the law he is giving is going to be. So he says, take this book of the law, place it beside the Ark of the Covenant for your God. There it will remain as a witness against you. For I know how rebellious and stiff-necked you are. So stiff-necked is stubborn. The image there is if you're putting reins on an ox or a horse or something you're trying to lead and trying to pull it to a direction, it just won't, right? Its neck is stiff. It's resisting your lead. That's what the image there is. How stiff-necked you are. If you have been rebellious with the Lord while I am still alive and with you, how much more will you rebel after I die? And then a few lines down. For I know that after my death you are sure to become utterly corrupt and to turn from the way I have commanded you. In days to come, disaster will fall on you because you will do evil in the sight of the Lord and arouse his anger by what your hands have made. So Moses, at the end of this giving of the law, essentially makes this prediction saying, this is going to end in disaster for you. And remember, the Israelites in some ways have been saying this the whole time in the wilderness. It would have been better if you had left us in Egypt, right? But now you've brought us out to starve to death in the wilderness, or you've brought us out to be killed by the great people of the land, or whatever it is. They have been repeatedly saying this. And at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses says, this is what's going to happen. Like maybe not today, not tomorrow, maybe not even 10 years from now, but this is where it's going to go. And as we read the story, this is the story of that happening, of disaster happening. And in some ways, all of the books we're going to read after Deuteronomy are telling the story to answer the question, how is it that we have been driven from the land? How is it that we have become subject to these empires? And it's answering the question in terms of Deuteronomy. We didn't do what we were supposed to do, and God rightly punished us. I mean, that's essentially what the answer is going to be that's coming through here. I think I mentioned this a week or two ago. Paul, when he talks about Moses, calls Moses' ministry the ministry of death. And he means that, a ministry of death. So it's a ministry. It is God's ministry. So he's not criticizing Moses. Moses is doing what God calls him to do. But Moses knows that the result of what he is called to do is actually going to end in disaster for Israel. At least in the I say the short term, but this is several centuries down. Now, from the perspective of the New Testament and even the later Old Testament, there is this restoration and there is this sense of a purification of Israel, a redemption of Israel that is hoped for. But in the short term, again, few centuries, but in the few centuries which follow, it's going to result in destruction and calamity. So in John chapter 1, we read, grace and truth, the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. That there's this contrast being made between Jesus and Moses. That Moses has a ministry given from God. It is a good ministry, but it is a ministry that leads to death. Jesus has a good ministry from God, and it is a ministry that raises life out of death, that resurrects from the dead. That these two things are both God's work. Moses and Jesus, we could say something like that. Law and gospel, this is what we're talking about when we say law and gospel. That these two things are the work of God, and that God is doing both of them. So then, as you go through the Song of Moses, so I'm looking at the end here. So now I'm on page 307. So here is Moses speaking for God here. And this is what God says. See now that I myself am he, there is no God besides me. I put to death and I bring to life. I wound and I heal. No one can deliver out of my hand. And that's going to come up again, especially in the prophets, when we get to the prophets, which I think is going to happen after New Year. That we're going to see again this sense of, I am the one who is doing all of this, death and life. It's not that some other evil God has beaten me temporarily, and that's why you're losing. No, this is all the one God who is forming a people out of Israel, eventually leading towards Messiah, right? This promise of Messiah. You'll start to notice, too, if you haven't already, that there are these promises that are named here, and don't get fully realized sort of in the history of Israel. One of them is Moses says, there will be a prophet like me raised up who will teach you all these things. And so that gets held on to. Okay, there's going to be a prophet like Moses. In the time of David, there's this kingdom, a descendant will sit on your throne forever. And after the throne of David and Jerusalem itself is destroyed and the temple is destroyed, they say, well, how could this promise of God, and this is 2 Samuel 7, how could this promise of God come to be? And that starts to be, why is Jesus called Son of David? Because they are saying, this guy might be the fulfillment of that promise that God made to David. So these promises begin to get held together in sort of this expectation of what will be God's Messiah, God's anointed, or in Greek, God's Christ. And as Christians, of course, we recognize Jesus as finally the fulfillment, although in a surprising way, of these promises going forward. Any questions on that? Does that make sense or enough sense? All right, the last thing I want to do then is give a little bit of a foreshadowing of what's coming. So this week we're reading through the book of Joshua. Joshua, so scholars often call the rest of this volume, the Covenant History volume, so the book of Joshua, Judges, and then 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. We'll also read Ruth, which is a little bit different. But those other books, scholars often call them the Deuteronomistic history. So it's a history written from the perspective of Deuteronomy is a way of thinking about that. And the form of the books that we have them in, the general consensus is that they are put together sometime after Jerusalem is destroyed, sometime after the exile into Babylon. Doesn't mean the stories originate from then, but in the form that we have them being put together into these books, they are being assembled by somebody or somebodies, possibly even in Babylon during the exile. And they are answering the question, how could this have happened? How did God let Israel, his chosen people, be overtaken by the Assyrian Empire, by the Babylonian Empire? How did God let the temple be destroyed? How did God let all these things happening? And so they are wrestling with this. So this is something of a history that's telling the story of what happened, using sources that they had, and as we get later, you'll see there will be references to it. It'll say, aren't all the other things that this king did, in the records of the kings of Judah, and it'll just then move on. And we don't have those records, so we're like, I don't know, I guess they are, but we don't have them. But clearly the person who's putting this together does, right? He's looking at, or they are looking at, histories there. But they're putting it together, and I think to answer a specific question, how is it that God has allowed this to happen to us? And so Joshua is the start of this. And so when we're reading through Joshua in some ways is a little bit idealized, but it's also going to be saying, well, this is maybe how things should have been had we listened to God as we should have. And as we see, and especially as we get to Judges, things break down almost immediately. And even in the book of Joshua, things are breaking down a bit. But Judges is really, it's really breaking down throughout that. And so that's, when we're reading Joshua, read it in that sense of this is people looking back on something that happened centuries before, trying to answer the question, how did it all go so wrong? Joshua is an interesting book also about the way it describes warfare. So just as we talked about this law of the king in Deuteronomy, where the king is not supposed to do any of the things that kings are supposed to do, by any sort of rational standard, but rather is a strange sort of king. The conquest in Joshua is a strange sort of conquest. It's not warfare that any rational king would wage. For one, they aren't allowed to enslave the peoples in the land, which is like one of the main reasons kings go to war. They're not allowed to take most of the wealth. There are some exceptions to that, but they're not allowed to take the wealth from it. They're not allowed to make certain covenants with the people in the land. Again, that sort of does happen anyway. But and then finally the famous kind of opening battle of Joshua is the conquest of Jericho. And does anybody remember the story of what happens with Jericho when the walls came tumbling down? Right? So what do? They go and they march. They take their whole army and they follow the throne of God, the Ark of the Covenant, and they parade for 7 days around the outside. Basically, they show off their entire strength to the enemy for 7 days, and they wear themselves out with all this marching. And then at the end of it, who conquers Jericho? God does. Right? So in the sense, Joshua is God fighting for Israel, but it's also clear in Joshua, there's this interesting scene where Joshua meets the commander of the armies of the Lord, and Joshua says, whose side are you on? And he says, neither. I'm the commander of the armies of the Lord. That God is fighting for Israel, but God can also fight against Israel. And as we'll see, God is not necessarily on Israel's side because they're Israel. God is on Israel's side, but when Israel turns against God, God will also be against Israel. And we saw a little bit of hints of that in Deuteronomy. You will know what it's like to have me against you, God says. And so as we're reading Joshua, pay attention to all those things about the ways that it's portraying this very strange form of warfare. And, there's the archaeological evidence that we have doesn't line up super well with what's in Joshua, which could be an issue of dating. It's hard to know where the breakdown is there. The big example is the best evidence we have right now, but this could change because, science is learning new evidence and trying to fit it into what is that Jericho was uninhabited at the time of the Exodus. So, but a few centuries earlier had its walls destroyed by an earthquake. So maybe we've got the whole dating of the Exodus wrong. Maybe that's part of where the lineup's wrong. Maybe we have the dating of the archaeology wrong. Maybe what's happening in Joshua isn't meant to be historical quite in the sense that we would understand military history today. I don't know the answer to that, but that's just something to raise up, that how to read this specifically is interesting. I do think that the story of the Jericho sounds sort of like a liturgical celebration. Doesn't it sound like something we might do on a fancy worship night, parade and sing outside the building or something like that? The celebration of God's victory over the forces that oppress us. Remember, Jericho is a symbol of Egypt's imperial strength in the region. And probably the strongest one, actually. So, let's see, anything else? Yeah, I think that's everything that I have introing to Joshua. Perfect. I've got a couple minutes early. Any final questions before I close this in prayer? Then please pray with me. Good and gracious God, we thank you for your faithfulness to us. Continue to do your work in and among us. Give us the words that we need in order to more closely follow you. Challenge us where we err. Comfort us when we repent. Give to us all that you see that we need. In Jesus' name, amen.